You may have all kinds of opinions about Korean cinema, but when it comes to horror, they never shy away from reality. And this film, The Divine Being, brings to the screen in a highly confrontational way both public tragedies that once shook society, and the hidden corners lurking beneath the shadow of power. Even more daringly, the film openly touches on sensitive eras and special contexts, using the shell of horror to reflect a chilling projection of reality. Interestingly, the director makes a point of stating at the very beginning of the film that this story is purely fictional and has no connection to any real events or individuals. Yet this very disclaimer ends up provoking even more associations. The timeline of the story is also quietly pulled back to that unusually tense and extraordinary period in 2022. One day, news program producer Yun Jihi suddenly receives a tip from a member of the public. The informant claims that leading presidential candidate Kim Suk-il is a fervent believer in occult practices. Some people even claim to have personally witnessed him kneeling and praying repeatedly before a statue in the early hours of the morning. There are also rumors that his wife, Yun Jihi, is descended from a line of shamans and has conducted ritual ceremonies on multiple occasions. After reviewing large amounts of material, Yun Jihi discovers that many past presidents were deeply fascinated by occult beliefs. Not only that, under their leadership, numerous incidents involving massive loss of life had also occurred. This makes Yun Jihi realize that the matter is far more complicated than it appears.
그뿐이에요? 예? 남해에서 페리오 침몰해서 300명 가까이 희생된 거 생각해봐요. 나도 이거 처음엔 진짜 안 믿었는데 파면 팔수록 계속 이상한 냄새가 나니까 이게.
Superstitious figures in power, in order to maintain their authority, are said to have chosen to offer living people as sacrifices. This would undoubtedly be an explosive news story. And so, Yun Jihi sets out with his two assistants to dig into the unspeakable secrets behind Kim Suk-il. After speaking with people close to Yun Jihi, they learn that her former name was Myeonja. When she was very young, her father passed away due to illness. The mother and daughter made a large sum of money through land flipping, and her mother soon took a lover, with some people recalling that intimate behavior often took place openly at home right in front of Yun Jihi. A broken family combined with a distorted upbringing led Yun Jihi to develop an extreme personality. It was also during this period that she became obsessively fascinated with Japanese occult practices, driven by jealousy toward the school beauty's looks. Yun Jihi invited classmates to play a spirit-calling game and urged supernatural forces to ruin the girl's appearance. Yun Jihi understood clearly that beauty is a woman's most powerful weapon. As a result, in order to become more attractive, she went through countless cosmetic procedures. During her college years, eager to break into high society, Yun Jihi often frequented nightclubs with her close friend. Ordinary men rarely caught their attention, as elites with social status were the true targets of their hunt. Relying on her attractive appearance, Yun Jihi easily drew the attention of a doctor, but before half a year of marriage had passed, the two divorced. Yun Jihi's mother was no simple figure either, as through Chairman Ju of a construction company, she gained access to many influential figures from political and business circles. The mother and daughter specifically prepared an entertainment venue for these powerful individuals, and within it they enshrined a mysterious shamanic figure. After learning this information, Yun Jihi immediately took his two assistants to that private club. However, the old-style building was not only locked, but all of its windows were covered with white cloth. Except for a single uncovered window, they quickly snapped a photo of the interior, and the information visible in the image matched the contents of the tip-off letter exactly. This was enough to prove that this place was indeed Yun Jihi's base of operations. What Yun Jihi and his team did not know was that every move they made was being captured by surveillance cameras outside the building. Since they failed to obtain many useful leads, Yun Jihi and the others had no choice but to follow another tip and head to a different location for further investigation. Located in the suburbs, this site was where Chairman Ju of the construction company regularly honored a monk, coming here whenever he faced business decisions to seek guidance. Yet during the investigation, they encountered only an elderly woman, who turned out to be Kim Suk-il's aunt. In the past, she had helped attend to the monk, but unfortunately, not long after, the monk passed away. At that time, no one knew what methods Yun Jihi's mother used to become Chairman Ju's lover. During that period, every time Chairman Ju came to seek fortune readings, he would bring the mother and daughter along with him. Coincidentally, Kim Suk-il was also there at the time, preparing for the judicial exam, and under Yun Jihi's deliberate temptation, the two quickly became involved. The monk once analyzed Yun Jihi's destiny, saying that if the two were together, Yun Jihi would eventually dominate Kim Suk-il, and that this would sooner or later lead to serious trouble. On one occasion, Chairman Ju failed to receive the fortune result he wanted, got into a fierce argument with the monk, and the meeting ended on very bad terms. Not long after, Chairman Ju brought in a mysterious shaman, and after they crossed paths with the monk was later found to have taken his own life that same night. After obtaining many clues from the elderly woman, Jung Hyun-soo and the others immediately returned to their car to organize the useful information. During this process, they discovered that in Kim Suk-il's family portrait, there was a Buddhist mantra originating from Japan. The meaning of this mantra is positive, but some practitioners still use it for harmful purposes. In a past era of regional conflict, some believers even wrote such mantras on their clothing, hoping to draw extraordinary strength from them.
일본의 권력자들은 오래전부터 주술을 통해 희생자들이 많이 나오면 나올수록 자신들의 권력이 유지된다고 믿었다고 한다. 그들은 만 명을 희생시키면 신이 된다고 한다.
Jung Hyun-soo speculated that Yun Jihi must have a close connection to Japanese occult practices, so after returning to the studio, they wasted no time and started a live broadcast, revealing the results of their investigation to the Korean public. Because the topic involved national leadership figures, the number of viewers in the live stream quickly climbed into the tens of thousands. If this topic were pushed into the public spotlight, it would undoubtedly have a major impact on Kim Suk-il's presidential campaign. Jung Hyun-soo's team originally planned to press forward and continue digging into Yun Jihi's secrets, but just as they were about to leave, their car suddenly lost control for no apparent reason. Clearly, this was a warning from powerful figures operating behind the scenes. However, Jung Hyun-soo had no intention of backing down, and insisted on finding Yun Jihi's former close friend, hoping to obtain additional useful leads from her. After all, this concerned the future of the nation, and allowing someone obsessed with occult beliefs to become president would be a disaster for ordinary people. According to the close friend, when Yun Jihi worked at nightclubs back then, she entered a social circle centered around prosecutors' banquets, and successfully became involved with one of them. Through this connection, Yun Jihi even helped her mother resolve a legal case. Later on, however, Prosecutor Leon came under investigation for accepting bribes, and Yun Jihi's mother was also dragged into the case. Yun Jihi once brought hundreds of millions of won to offer as a bribe, but the officials handling the case refused to budge. Completely enraged, Yun Jihi secretly placed a curse on that official behind the scenes. After her actions, the official soon collapsed and died suddenly in public, while her mother successfully escaped further trouble. This explosive revelation made it impossible for Jung Hyun-soo to remain still. She immediately organized the team and launched another live broadcast.
저희에게 들어온 첩보에 의하면 김충석, 그는 일본 태생입니다.
김석일의 장인으로 불리는 사람이 일본 사람일 수 있다는 건데.
Several of them revealed that Yun Jihi's occult practices were deeply entangled with her father-in-law, Chairman Kim, and that the forces backing Chairman Kim were very likely connected to overseas influences. Seen this way, if Kim Suk-il were to become president, the country could end up falling under indirect external control. The next day, Jung Hyun-soo and the others arrived at a temple. It was rumored that a geomancy master there had once conducted ritual ceremonies for Yun Jihi. By pretending to be friends of Yun Jihi, they successfully met the temple's abbot, who was already well into his 70s. From the abbot's words alone, it was clear that his status was far from ordinary. The old abbot said that the geomancy master who performed the rituals for Yun Jihi was actually his own disciple. Back then, the master had even brought Yun Jihi to seek him out, hoping to learn certain forbidden techniques related to spiritual manipulation. It was only later that the master realized this woman's ambition was far greater than expected, as she intended to use such practices to dominate the entire nation. And after she met Chairman Kim, her influence seemed to grow stronger and stronger. Before long, Yun Jihi completely broke free from the master's control. Meanwhile, Chairman Kim was sitting beneath a flag with a rising sun motif, speaking in Japanese on the phone with a mysterious figure. At the same time, the shaman worshipped by Yun Jihi was carrying out a brutal ritual ceremony. The power backing Chairman Kim was clearly a secretive organization from abroad. They were willing to pay any price to push Kim Suk-il into power, all in order to build a puppet regime. After returning home, Jung Hyun-soo discovered that Yun Jihi's resume was identical to that of a woman named Lee Yun-ji. Lee Yun-ji and Yun Jihi had once been close friends, but after a minor conflict, Yun Jihi secretly placed a curse on her.
呪いの力で滅ぼされるがいい。さちけん呪い。
After Lee Yun Jihi died in a car accident, Yun Jihi shamelessly took over her identity and background. Now, at the most critical moment of Kim Suk-yeol's election campaign, Yun Jihi became entangled in endless scandals, and was even exposed for falsifying her resume. In order to calm public opinion, Yun Jihi was forced to hold a press conference, planning to appeal to emotion to win sympathy.
일과 학업을 함께하는 과정에서 제 잘못이 있었습니다. 경력을 부풀리고 잘못 적은 것도 있었습니다. 그러지 말았어야 했는데 돌이켜보니 너무나 부끄러운 일이었습니다.
After the press conference, Yoon Hyun-soo confronted her directly about the identity swap, but Yun Jihi did not dare to respond. With the presidential election set for the next day, Yoon Hyun-soo understood that if this couple were allowed to take control, everything would descend into chaos. She quickly launched a live stream, urging the public not to vote for Kim Suk-yeol. But for many ordinary people, did it really matter who became president?
그놈이 그놈이야. 누가 되든 걔가 내 월세라도.
Under behind-the-scenes manipulation, Kim Suk-yeol won the election by a narrow margin, becoming the nation's 20th president. The first thing he did after taking office was to order prosecutors to search Yoon Hyun-soo's home. Fortunately, Yoon Hyun-soo had already placed all the evidence onto a cross-shaped hard drive and entrusted it to her daughter to take away. No matter how the prosecutors questioned her, Yoon Hyun-soo maintained a stance of complete silence. At the same time, having reached the peak of power, Kim Suk-yeol and his wife immediately went to pay respects to the mysterious shaman they worshipped. However, through a spiritual ritual, they received a message advising them not to move into the presidential residence. Early the next morning, Kim Suk-yeol held a press conference announcing that the presidential office would be relocated to the Ministry of Defense building, and that the former residence would be open to the public. To address concerns over the use of government funds, Kim Suk-yeol also invited a geomancy expert to help explain the decision. Not long after, however, a horrifying crowd crush incident broke out in Itaewon. That night, facing the overwhelming crowd, the officers on duty immediately called for backup, but to their shock, other units turned off their radios and pretended not to hear the calls. The tragedy had an enormous impact, and even Yoon Hyun-soo's daughter lost her life in the incident. When Yoon Hyun-soo returned to the scene, she accidentally saw Yun Jihi squatting on the ground, muttering strange incantations. As a truck drove past, Yun Jihi vanished without a trace, yet a shaman dressed in black remained kneeling in the alley, continuing to chant softly. Yun Jihi's appearance made Yoon Hyun-soo realize that the Itaewon crowd disaster was far from as simple as it seemed. In order to expose the conspiracy behind those in power, she deliberately went to a church and sought out a well-known local priest. Yoon Hyun-soo hoped to use the priest's standing to bring the truth into the open.
그럼에도 불구하고 참사를 사고라 부르고 희생자를 사망자로 표기하라는 정부의 지침은 이 일이 자신들과 관계없음을 만천하에 알려 책임을 회피하고자 하는 저열한 수작질에 불과합니다.
Faced with Yoon Hyun-soo's counterattack, Yun Jihi was already prepared. She instructed her geomancy master to speak publicly, claiming that the sacrifices of these young people had meaning, and that the government should take this opportunity to present the nation to the world. But Yoon Hyun-soo did not give up, as she openly questioned the level of police response during her live stream. According to their investigation, on the night of the incident, most police resources were deliberately redirected to other operations, resulting in very few officers stationed in Itaewon. And the day before the incident, the local district head had even shared lunch with Kim Suk-yeol.
그날 그들은
참사 당일 사고 현장에서 차량으로 불과 5분 거리에 위치한 김석일 대통령의 용영 관저 인근에는 208 경비단 경찰 인력들이 대기 중이었습니다. 하지만 그날 김 대통령은 서초동 아크스타 자택에 머물고 있었습니다. 대통령도 없는 텅 빈 대통령 용영 관저 인근에 208 경비단 소속 3개 중대가 배치된 겁니다.
Finally, Yoon Hyun-soo mentioned the mysterious shaman she encountered that night, noting that the shaman's attire closely resembled that of clergy from a modern overseas religious movement. When all these events were connected, the implications became deeply unsettling. At that moment, one of the assistants noticed a strange comment appearing in the live stream chat: East, South, West, and North. The commenter also left an address, claiming to know the truth behind everything. Yoon Hyun-soo and the others did not dare to let their guard down, and immediately rushed to the agreed internet cafe, only to find that there was nothing there but a half-grown child. Despite their doubts, they still followed the child deep into a basement, arriving at a mysterious room. The walls of the room were covered with countless names, making it look like some kind of ritual site. After the child changed into a set of white clothes, his voice suddenly became deep and rough.
일본엔 시토파시라는 게 있어. 살아있는 사람들 중에 순수한 영혼을 가진 젊은 사람들을 죽여 제물로 바쳐서 자기 죄를 대신 짊어지고 하늘로 가라는 인신공양 풍습이야. 이번처럼 사람들 많이 죽게 한 건 주술을 부린 거고, 그래야 자기들이 들어가 살 집이 편안해진다고 믿는 거야.
The boy spoke of various major social disasters, explaining that East, South, West, and North corresponded to the 5 elements, including metal, wood, water, fire, and earth. He claimed that these incidents were deliberately orchestrated by Kim Suk-il and his wife to strengthen their own fate and fortune. The boy bluntly told them that Yun Jihi had willingly invited a malevolent spirit to possess her, in exchange for supreme power. Now, he said, they only needed to complete the final step to close the cycle of the 5 elements ritual. Without wasting any time, Yoon Hyun-soo and the others immediately went live, exposing this occult conspiracy to the public. Once the news broke, Kim Suk-il was instantly thrown into a massive public storm, faced with relentless questions from reporters. He refused to give any direct answers. Meanwhile, on the other side, Yun Jihi had not stopped at all, as she was carrying out an extremely disturbing ritual at her family's ancestral burial grounds. After nearby villagers accidentally witnessed the scene, they immediately contacted Yoon Hyun-soo's team. The group did not waste words, and the moment they arrived at the ritual site, they turned on the live stream.
여기 한번 보실까요? 윤지희, 김석일 합장 이렇게 쓰여 있습니다.
통상 불교에서는 복을 기원하기 위해 붉은 연등을 사용합니다. 흰색 연등은 죽은 자를 기릴 때 사용하는 것인데 왜 이곳에는 흰색 연등이 걸려 있을까요?
After showing viewers the eerie atmosphere of the place, Yoon Hyun-soo and the others left without looking back, completely unaware that Yun Jihi was standing not far away. Not long after, Yoon Hyun-soo's team received another shocking piece of information, as Kim Suk-il's father-in-law, Chairman Kim, had publicly expressed support for controversial historical actions by foreign forces, and even called for closer ties between the two countries. In order to gather more evidence, Yoon Hyun-soo's team went to Chairman Kim's stronghold. On the surface, it appeared to be an art exhibition hall, but in reality, it was a private venue where Chairman Kim received foreign visitors. They secretly photographed everyone entering and leaving the building, but the cunning Chairman Kim quickly saw through their intentions. He immediately ordered his people to silence Yoon Hyun-soo and the others without mercy. After all, Yun Jihi was about to carry out the final ritual, and there could be no mistakes. At the same time, a terrifying scheme was unfolding in the shadows, as Kim Suk-il used tensions on the Korean peninsula as an excuse to place the entire country under emergency control, with the real goal of provoking mass protests and then ordering the military to suppress the crowds. Meanwhile, Yun Jihi prepared her altar, intending to harvest the souls of these young people to complete the final ritual. What they did not know was that the mysterious boy from before had also set up his own altar, ready to confront them head-on. After a prolonged and brutal spiritual struggle, the confrontation finally ended with the boys' victory. With the 5 elements ritual destroyed, Kim Suk-il was impeached and removed from power by the public. As for Yoon Hyun-soo, She had already entrusted the cross-shaped USB drive to the priest for safekeeping before her death. After learning that all three had died under suspicious circumstances, the priest decisively went live and released all the contents of the USB drive to the public. It turned out that the true goal of Kim Suk-il and his wife was to provoke war on the Korean peninsula. It turned out that the true aim of Kim Suk-il and his wife was to push the region toward large-scale conflict, as the altar dedicated to foreign dark spirits was smashed. Their grand ambitions were completely shattered. Alright, that's where today's story ends, and I'll see you next time.